Relax and listen to the voice. Hello everyone. Welcome to our installment on true scary stories. This episode will bring you tales of murderers, madmen, stalkers, kidnappings, and all sorts of other real-life horrors. Please remember to like and to subscribe. Share the video with your family and friends if you've enjoyed it. And without further ado, here we go. When I was 3 years old, my parents and I lived in an old house. My bedroom was connected to my parents' room by a walk-in closet. If you went and opened their closet and went inside, there was a door at the back that led directly to my room. While we were living there, my mother started having terrible nightmares. Every nightmare was the same. In a dream, she would wake up in bed to find she was surrounded by fire. In a panic, she would rush through the closet, into my room, grab me, and then dive out of the window. Suddenly her dream would flash forward and she would find herself sitting with my father in a waiting room at the hospital. A doctor would come in looking very somber and sad and say, "I'm sorry, but your son is dead." At that point, she always woke up in a cold sweat with her heart racing. One night my mother was awakened by my screaming. She ran into my room and held me in her arms. She was trying to calm me down and ask me what was wrong. All I could say was, "Mommy, Mommy, my room was on fire. I was on fire." After the recurring nightmares she had been having, this really freaked her out. It wasn't long before my parents decided to move and sell the house. About 6 months after we moved out, my mother got a phone call from my grandmother. She started telling my mother that there had been a fire in the house we used to live in. Luckily, no one was home at the time, but the room that had been my bedroom was completely destroyed in the blaze. The fire had started because of an electrical short and some wires in the walk-in closet. This story always gives me the chills whenever I tell it. Berserk was a very successful arcade game that was released in 1980. It was invented by Andrew McNeil after he had had a nightmare where he was trapped in a video game and forced to fight robots. The title of the game came from a book called The Berserker Stories, about robots who go insane and kill everybody. Berserk was the first video game in history that actually killed 2 of its players. In the game, you have to guide a little man around a maze which is filled with killer robots who fire lasers at you. If the robots shoot you, you die. If the robots touch you, you die. If you touch the walls, you die. Your nemesis is a bouncing smiley face named Evil Otto who appears out of nowhere and tries to destroy you. Evil Otto is unusual because there's no way to kill him. Berserker was one of the first games to use speech. When you walked by it in the arcade, it would scream, "Coins detected in pocket." During the game, Evil Otto would scream, "Intruder alert! Intruder alert! The humanoid must not escape! Kill it!" In January of 1981, Jeff Daly became the first person to be killed by playing a video game. The 19-year-old died of a massive heart attack right after attaining a high score of 16,660 on Berserk. In April of 1982, 18-year-old Peter Burkowski arrived at Friar Tuck's game room in Calumet City, Illinois. He went straight to the video game machines, dropped a coin into the slot, and started playing Berserk. After 15 minutes, he got his initials into the top 10 scoreboard, and then he suddenly collapsed and died of a heart attack. Evil Otto watched both of them die, with a big smile on his digital face. Over the years, there have been a number of other fatalities caused by playing video games. A 33-year-old man from China died after a staggering 27 days of online gameplay. That's roughly 650 hours of non-stop gaming. Over this period of time, he barely drank or slept, and all he ate was ramen noodles. The coroner's report said that he died of heart failure and malnutrition. A 13-year-old girl named Anna Lee Kehoe was playing with her Xbox 360 when she started muttering, "Mom, I can't breathe." She suffered a heart attack so severe that she was left brain dead and on life support. Anna Lee's parents decided to pull the plug, making her one of the youngest video game deaths in history. Anna Lee had had asthma, and the doctors speculated that an asthma attack may have contributed to her heart attack. A South Korean man died in 2005 after playing StarCraft. He lost his job and his girlfriend because he spent all of his time playing the game. After a 50-hour gaming binge, Lee told his friends he was going to stop playing and go home. Then, he closed his eyes and he fell off of his chair. Lee died of heart failure caused by exhaustion and dehydration. In 2007, a 26-year-old man named Zhang from northeast China died of heart failure after a week-long marathon of online gaming during a national holiday. Zhang was an internet addict who weighed over 330 pounds and never got any physical exercise. In 2012, an 18-year-old gamer from Taiwan named Shuang died after playing Diablo 3 for 40 hours straight. He was in an internet cafe at the time, passed out by a terminal. When he was awoken by an employee, he managed to stand up, took a few steps, and then collapsed. No cause of death was identified at the time, and police were investigating what might have led to Shuang's untimely demise. The most recent video game death was 20-year-old Chris Staniforth from the United Kingdom, who suffered a pulmonary embolism. Chris frequently participated in 12-hour-long Halo sessions without breaks, and during one campaign, a blood clot traveled from his legs into his lungs, killing him instantly. Remember these stories the next time someone says, "Video games have never hurt anybody." Vladimir Kazaku was a 43-year-old man who lived in Bucharest, Romania, and worked as a fire eater in a circus. Vlad would always hold a flammable cocktail in his mouth so he could spit fire at a burning torch. He called it eating fire, and it always got a big round of applause. On the 23rd of January in 1998, Vlad was performing his fire-spitting routine when he accidentally swallowed some of the flammable liquid. As he put a flaming torch into his mouth to eat the fire, he belched. The vapors from his stomach caught fire, and Vlad suddenly exploded. The stunned onlookers assumed it was all part of an amazing illusion. At first, they even began clapping. Then they slowly realized what had happened. The explosion was so powerful that Vlad's body was blown to pieces. They found his head in a popcorn machine. The tragedy horrified onlookers in the circus, and many of the audience members required treatment for shock following the incident. "It was the most awful thing I've ever seen," said one witness. "He was so graceful and everyone was applauding. Then he burped and he was blown to bits." About 10 years ago, my 3-year-old son and I moved into a house. It was a very old building, and the inside of the house always seemed to be just a little darker and a little colder than it should have been. Not long after we moved in, a friend of mine came to visit. The whole time we were sitting and talking, she seemed very uncomfortable. When I looked at her face, I noticed that something in the other room had caught her attention. Her eyes grew very wide, and she suddenly said, "I have to go." I asked her what was wrong, but she refused to tell me. Her odd reaction to whatever that was freaking me out, so I kept after her. On her way out of the door, she finally blurted out, "This house is haunted," but she wouldn't tell me what it was that made her think so. To this day, she still refuses to tell me what she saw. About a week later, my 3-year-old son casually asked me who the old lady in the bathroom was. One day, as I was leaving for work, I got to the car, and then I realized I needed to run back to the house to get something. I walked into the house, and as soon as I got inside, This framed photo on the wall shot off of the wall. It didn't fall down. It shot horizontally away from the wall, and it landed on a mosaic table with enough force to break some of the tiles off of the table. I felt like whatever was in the house was pissed off that I came back in after it thought that I had left for the day. After living in the house for about 6 months, I noticed a weird square cut into the boards on the deck. There was no handle, but I was able to pry the thing up. The hole was just big enough to fit through, and there was a ladder that went down. For some reason I went down, and I found myself inside what looked like a homemade basement. It was basically just a room dug out of the earth with no constructed walls or stone supports or anything like that. It was very dark, but I could see something over in the corner. It was a really suspicious looking stone. It looked like one of those old headstones you see in cemeteries. As I started to walk towards it, some insects started jumping all over me, so I got freaked out and I climbed back up out of that basement as fast as I could, and I've never gone back. Now this is the part that affected me the most. It's also the reason that we left the house. One night I was in bed, laying on my stomach, just about to fall asleep. I heard what sounded like someone walking into the room. The footsteps came from the doorway over to my bed, and I didn't realize until later that the fact that I heard the footsteps was weird because the room was carpeted. Anyway, when the footsteps reached my bed, I felt someone put their hands on my back. 2 hands, just gently laid flat on my back and kept there. I assumed it was my son. Since I was drifting off to sleep, I stirred a little bit and I asked him what he was doing. I asked him, but there was no answer. I looked up and there was no one there. I got up and I checked my son's bedroom, but he was in bed, fast asleep. I couldn't stop thinking about it, and we moved out of the house very soon after that. When I was just a little boy, I had an imaginary friend. At least, I thought he was an imaginary friend. Today, I can't be so sure. I would see him from time to time around my house. He was a man, and he lurked in the shadows. He was completely black from head to toe, and his skin was charred and pockmarked like a burnt match. I couldn't make out his face or any other features. All I could see were his red eyes. He had the most terrifying red eyes. Even now, when I think of them, it gives me the chills. He appeared at random and without any warning. I would be playing with my toys and then all of a sudden, he would just be there. He never made a single sound, and he never said a word. He never did anything really, except standing there, staring at me and smiling. Then he would vanish as quietly and as suddenly as he had come. As time went by, I got accustomed to his presence. It got to the point where he would appear and I would just glance at him, then go back to playing with my toys. I could always feel his eyes on me as he was standing ever so close or ever so far away. My family knew about him because I had talked about him, but they never saw him for themselves. My mother and father thought it was cute that I had an imaginary friend, but when I described him to them, they got a little bit creeped out. Rightfully so, I'd say. My sister was the only one who believed he was real, and she said she was scared of him. One time, I had just finished going to the toilet and washing my hands. I was standing on a little stool so I could reach the sink. All of a sudden, I saw the man out of the corner of my eye. He was walking up the stairs. I called my sister and told her the man was here. She came running over, but just when I was about to point at the man, he walked backwards down the stairs until he was out of sight. When she left, he came creeping back up the stairs. I gave up trying to show him to people because he clearly did not want to be seen. Eventually, my family moved out of that house. I remember seeing the man with the red eyes watching us as the moving van pulled away. He didn't follow us, and I didn't see him again after that. As I got older, I just kind of dismissed him as a figment of my childish imagination. Years passed by and I'd kind of forgotten about him. And then one night, when I was 16 years old, I was walking upstairs to my bedroom. It was after midnight. As I was walking down the hallway, something emerged from one of the other bedrooms. It stepped out into the light, and I realized, to my horror, that it was the man with the red eyes. I stopped in my tracks and froze. My heart was up in my throat. He just stood there, staring at me. The red eyes burned bright, and he flashed me a malicious smile. Then, still staring at me, he slowly walked across the hallway and into my bedroom. If this was in a movie, perhaps I would have chased him down and forced him to tell me who or what he was. Perhaps it would have ended in me fighting him to the death. But this wasn't a movie. It was real life, and I did neither of those things. I simply turned around, ran back down the stairs, and fled from my house. I sat on the curb outside, shivering and shaking until dawn arrived. I haven't seen that man again since. I'm a 22-year-old from Boston, and I need help because I'm absolutely terrified. Ever since I was 15 or 16, I've been having a recurring nightmare. Every month I have the same horrible dream again and again. In the nightmare, I find myself alone in an abandoned building. I'm standing in a dimly lit hallway when all of a sudden I hear very distant sounds. It's like a thudding sound. The violent blows echo throughout the building, and then the noises begin to come closer, creeping towards me down a long and gloomy corridor. That's when the terror grips me, and I turn and start running back down the hallway, searching desperately for a place to hide. I run until I reach a door at the end of the hallway, and there's nowhere else to go. I open the door, and I find an unfinished bathroom. I close the door behind me. I crouch down in the corner, and I listen to the sound of the violent blows drawing ever closer. Thud, 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 thud. Finally, the noise reaches the bathroom, and heavy blows rain down on the bathroom door where I'm hiding. Bam, 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 bam! The door trembles with every blow, and I bury my head between my legs, hoping it'll end. The sound of the blows becomes louder and stronger. Bam, bam, bam! Just when the door seems as if it's about to give in, I wake up in my own bed, shaking and sweating. Every day after I have this nightmare, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. It's as if someone or something's watching everything I do at every moment of the day. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I catch a glimpse of a girl. I've seen her when I was in class at school. I've seen her when I was walking down the street, or even when I was just hanging out with friends. As soon as I notice her, she seems to disappear into thin air. She seems to be a girl around my age, and she's always dressed in gray. Whenever I spot her, I only catch a brief glimpse, but afterwards, I can't stop shaking. It was about 3 months ago when I was flipping through the newspaper that I read the horrible news about the murders. It seems that an entire family in my city had been brutally killed. The father, mother, and 2 teenage daughters were beaten to death in their own apartment. Their 3rd daughter was missing. There were some black and white photos of the crime scene. The photos were taken in the family's living room. It was completely destroyed. The table lay in pieces, the curtains were all torn up, there was a mirror that was broken, glass everywhere, the carpets were covered in splinters and pieces of shattered glass and broken table, and there were pools of blood all over the floor as well. But that's not what caught my attention and caused me to break out into a cold sweat. It was one of the other photos. The photo of the missing daughter. I recognized her immediately. It was the girl from my dreams. It was the girl that I keep seeing. I'd started calling her the girl in gray. I was sure it was the same girl I'd caught fleeting glimpses of out of the corner of my eye. Although I'd only seen her from afar, I was sure that it was her. Absolutely certain. That night after I'd seen those pictures, I was terrified of going to sleep. I was honestly just terrified of what I might dream. I tried desperately to stay awake. I drank endless cups of coffee and glasses of Coke, but it was to no use. Eventually, my brain and my body gave out, and I got tired enough to fall asleep. And then I had that nightmare again. In the dream, I found myself back in the dingy abandoned building, and again, I heard those noises, those thudding sounds. The nightmare was the same as it had always been, except for one thing. This time, I didn't wake up when the door finally gave in to the strong blows. Instead, I heard the door cracking, and I felt the splinters blasting all over me. And then I looked up, and I saw what was standing there. It was the girl in gray. Her hair was long, her skin was pale, and she was barefoot. When I finally saw her face, it left me petrified. Even though this was a girl, her face was almost the same as mine. It was like looking into a mirror. She stood there before me, staring at me with a sinister smile on her face. In one hand, she held a bloody iron bar. I was paralyzed by fear and I couldn't move, and at that moment, for some reason I realized in my dream that I was completely naked. That's when the girl came rushing towards me. She jumped on top of me, but she never landed on me. Instead, she seemed to go right through me. It was as if she had somehow jumped into me or something. When I woke up, I was terrified and I was sweating. I had the strangest feeling inside of me. It felt like there was something moving around inside my stomach. Since that time, I've never seen the gray girl again. I've also stopped having the nightmares often, but in exchange for that, now I hardly sleep, and when I do, it's as if I've blacked out. I'll wake up in strange places. I've done things that people have told me about that I have no recollection of, and I've essentially stopped eating. I was living in a very old house in the suburbs, and one of my friends came to visit me. He was staying for 4 weeks and brought a lot of bags and suitcases with him. There was only one bedroom in the house, so we slept on the sofa in the front living room. One morning, my friend burst into my bedroom yelling, "Fire! Fire!" I woke up, groggy and confused. I wasn't sure what was going on, and I suspected that he might be trying to play a prank on me. I jumped out of my bed, and that's when I felt it. The floor was extremely hot under my feet. My friend ran out into the hallway, and I followed right behind him. I couldn't see the fire anywhere, but as we ran towards the front door, I heard the sounds of roaring and crackling all around me. The fire was inside of the walls. We ran out the front door and across the lawn. When we got to the sidewalk, I turned and I looked at the house. There was thick black smoke billowing out of the roof. We stood there for a few moments, watching as the flames overtook the house. That's when I happened to look down and I noticed that all my friend's bags and suitcases were neatly lined up on the sidewalk. When he realized that the house was on fire, he'd taken the time to carry all of his luggage outside before he came back inside to wake me up. His bags and his suitcases were more important to him than I was. The fire had started quickly in the basement where the furnace was, and it had spread up into the walls. It had been burning the entire foundation of the floor that we had been standing on. The entire floor and much of the house collapsed into a fiery pit not long after we escaped. After the firemen put out the blaze, they told us we were very lucky to be alive. If we didn't escape from the house when we did, we would have probably been trapped inside. I've never been able to let go of the fact that he took the time to carry his bags and suitcases outside. Needless to say, though we both survived, and he did wake me up and get me out of the house, we're not really friends anymore. In a bad part of town, the police were called to investigate a mysterious death. A man was found dead in an elevator. He was slumped against the wall and there were 2 holes in his neck. His skin was pale white and all of the blood had been drained from his body. The most puzzling thing about it was that there were no bloodstains in the elevator, no fingerprints, and no signs of forced entry. Things took another bizarre turn 1 month later when a 13-year-old girl was found dead in the same elevator with 2 identical puncture wounds in her throat. Her body had also been almost sucked dry of blood. Rumors began to spread around the area that there was a vampire on the loose. The people who lived in the building were in a panic, and they refused to use the elevator. The police were under pressure to get to the bottom of the mysterious deaths, so they staked out the apartments. A detective and a sergeant were posted inside of the elevator, riding it up and down for days on end. On the third day, the elevator suddenly shuddered to a halt, and the lights went out. The two men were plunged into absolute darkness. They pulled out their flashlights and contacted their colleagues by radio to let them know that they were trapped and the elevator had stopped. There was a long silence, then they heard a strange clicking sound. It seemed to be coming from the roof of the elevator. Clicking didn't seem to be right. The sound continued. It sounded more like a tapping. Their hearts began beating fast as they realized something big was crawling around up there. That's when they noticed that there was a hole in the roof where a panel had fallen away. The detective aimed his flashlight at the gap, and he had to fight back sheer terror when he saw something peering through. It was a small, hairy head, about the size of his fist, with 8 black, shining eyes. The sergeant was claustrophobic, and also had a deathly fear of spiders. He flew into a panic and dropped his flashlight. Suddenly, the enormous spider sprang into the elevator and landed on the sergeant's face. It sank its jaws into his cheek, started biting and sucking out his blood. The sergeant was screaming out, and for a moment, the detective was paralyzed as well. Then he took his gun out, aimed, and he fired. The first shot blew off one of the spider's hairy legs. The sergeant stopped screaming and his body collapsed to the floor. The wounded creature raced up the wall, and the detective could feel its bristly hairs as it rushed past it to escape out the hatch. When their colleagues managed to open the doors of the elevator, the scene that they found was nightmarish. The sergeant's corpse lay slumped against the wall, and the traumatized detective was curled up in the corner. The army was called in, and they destroyed the spider with a flamethrower, but then they discovered that it had laid eggs at the top of the elevator shaft. The Russian authorities moved quickly to hush up the incident, but news leaked out in a Turkish newspaper, which claimed that the giant spider was mutated by the radioactive fallout from the Chernobyl nuclear plant disaster. The Russians denied this and claimed that the story was an exaggeration. Is this story true? There's no way to tell for sure, but it's definitely something to think about if you're ever stuck in an elevator. This all happened 28 years ago, when I was only about 8 years old. My mother and father would often take me to visit my grandparents for Halloween. My aunt lived 2 houses down from my grandparents, and I could go trick-or-treating with my cousins. Between my grandparents' place and my aunt's place, there was an old, dilapidated house. We always skipped it when we went trick-or-treating on Halloween night, because the woman who lived there gave us all the creeps. She was a very big woman, over 6 feet tall, and she wore chains around her neck and heavy work boots. There was obviously something very wrong with her. Whenever we went back and forth between my aunt's place and my grandparents' place, we always had to run past the woman's house, because she was always standing at her windows watching us. It was so creepy that none of us would ever dare to even run past her house alone. Sometimes the big woman would be outside of her house, watering the garden or scrubbing the windows. When we ran past, she would shout and yell at us and call us all kinds of names. She would tell us that the devil was coming for us. We told the adults about her, but they just told us to leave her alone and keep out of her way. One Halloween, we were going trick-or-treating, and my older cousin dared us to go up to the big woman's house and knock on the door. I remember being so scared, but I didn't want to look like a coward, so I agreed to do it. There we are, dressed up in our Halloween costumes. We walked up her driveway and we rang the doorbell. Suddenly, there was a lot of banging and slamming noises coming from the house. We were frightened, and I was about to run away when the door creaked open. The big woman was standing there in the dim light. She was holding something in her hands, and when we saw what it was, we all fled and ran screaming down the driveway. It was a severed head. When we got home, we were all shaking and out of breath. Some of the younger kids were crying. All the adults asked us what was wrong, and when we told them what we had seen, they just laughed. My grandfather said it was probably just a Halloween prop, and my grandmother told us we shouldn't be bothering the woman, and that it served us right that we had gotten such a scare. After we'd all calmed down, we went out again and continued our trick-or-treating. However, we kept well away from the big woman's house. About a month later, my mother got a phone call from my grandparents. They said that the big woman who lived next door had tried to murder my aunt. It seemed that my aunt had just come home from shopping. She was carrying her groceries in one arm, and she had my baby cousin in her other arm. Just as she got to her front door, the big woman appeared from behind her. She had a rope saw, and she put it around my aunt's neck, and she tried to saw her head off. My aunt flipped out and immediately dropped the groceries along with my baby cousin. She was in a fight for her life. My aunt managed to get her hands under the rope saw. She started kicking the front door with her feet as she struggled. Her husband heard all the commotion, and when he saw what was happening, he fetched a poker from the fireplace, and he beat the big woman until she laid there unconscious. My aunt and my cousin survived the attack, but it left my aunt with scars on her hands and a long scar across the front of her neck. Of course, the police were called and they arrested the big woman. When they searched her house, they found something that shocked everyone in the area. The woman had been digging tunnels under her home, which came up under my aunt's house, my grandparents' house, and another neighbor's house. She'd been bringing the dirt up and putting it in the raised flower beds in her garden, but that wasn't all. The most chilling discovery was that she had also built some kind of shrine under her house with candles and other stuff on it. At the center of the shrine was a real, severed human head. Needless to say, we believe it was the same severed head that we had seen when we were trick-or-treating on Halloween night. She had already murdered one woman and had cut off her head. My aunt almost became the next severed head in her collection. In the winter of 1935, there was a harsh blizzard in a small village in Japan. A cold wind was sweeping through the houses, and snow was falling heavily on the roofs, and a family of 5 lay asleep in their beds, unaware that they were about to receive a very strange visitor. Just after midnight, they were awoken from their peaceful slumber by a loud knock on the door. The father and mother got out of bed and they went to answer the door, while the children stumbled out of their bedrooms, wondering who could be disturbing them at this time of night. When the father opened the door, he found a stranger standing outside. The man was covered from head to toe in a long red cape. He was holding up a lantern, and his face was hidden in the shadow of his red hood. "I've been sent by your relatives," said the man. "Your mother has been struck down by a sudden illness, and her condition is very serious. She wants to see you before she dies." The husband hurriedly dressed, and after kissing his wife and children goodbye, he left with the man in the red cape. Together, they set out on the journey to his mother's house, which lay in the neighboring village. His wife waited anxiously for him to return while the children went back to bed. A couple of hours passed, and there was another loud knock on the door. When the mother answered it, she was surprised to see the man in the red cape again. "Your husband sent me back to fetch you," he said. "His mother's condition is getting worse. It's very likely that she will not last until the morning. He said he needs you by his side when the time comes." Just as her husband had done before her, the wife didn't waste any time and quickly got dressed. She took her children to the house of her neighbor, a middle-aged woman, and asked her to take care of them while she was away. With that, she said her goodbyes and followed the man in the red cape out into the snowy night. About an hour or two later, there was a loud knock at the door of the neighbor's house. The man in the red cape was waiting outside, and he asked to speak to the children. "I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but your grandmother has passed away. Your parents told me to come back and pick you up. They're waiting for you at your grandmother's house." The children were about to leave with the strange man when the neighbor grew suspicious and stopped them. She stood in the doorway and refused to let the children go. "You can't take the children out on a night like this," she told the man sternly. "We're in the middle of a blizzard. They'll catch their death of cold. There will be enough time for them to go tomorrow. If their grandmother is dead tonight, she'll still be dead in the morning." The man in the red cape kept insisting, but the neighbor was a stubborn woman and refused to budge an inch. The man wouldn't take no for an answer, but when the neighbor grabbed a broom and threatened to beat him within an inch of his life, he reluctantly gave up and walked off into the driving snow. The next morning, the countryside was covered in a thick blanket of snow. An old man got up early, and despite the cold weather, he decided to go out for a walk. As he was crossing the long wooden bridge that lay at the entrance to the village, he noticed something strange. There were some bright red patches in the snow. Looking closer, he was horrified when he realized that they were blood stains. Leaning against the railing of the bridge was a bloody axe. The old man grew frightened. The signs were unmistakable. There had been a murder. He hurried to the police station at the center of the village and reported everything he had found. The police searched the area and found the bodies of the missing father and the mother floating in the river. They had been brutally slaughtered, and their heads had been chopped off with an axe. After talking to their children and the neighbor, the police were in no doubt as to who was responsible. The mysterious man in the red cape had to be the killer, and it was clear that he had been trying to lure the children into going with him as well. If the neighbor woman had not stepped in when she did, the evil man would have murdered the children too. The incident was a major event at that time, and it shook the residents of the little village to their very core. None of them would ever again feel safe in their beds at night. The police never managed to discover the identity of the man in the red cape, and the case remains unsolved to this very day. No one ever got a good look at his face that night, and the strange visitor disappeared into the night as suddenly and as mysteriously as he had arrived. Ever since I was a child, I have always had a morbid fear of insects, especially cicadas. In Japan, we call them higurashi. They are large black and brown insects with wings, and they make a horrible high-pitched noise like... Some people who have heard it say that it sounds like they are screaming. A few weeks ago, I had a very scary and disturbing experience. This is not a ghost story, but it's a true story. I'm a single man in my late 20s, and I live alone. One weekend, I went to stay with some friends of mine who lived in another city. I came home on Sunday night, and when I arrived back at my apartment, it was quite late. I unlocked the door, and as soon as I stepped inside, I had the strangest feeling that something was very, very wrong. Then I heard an unexpected and eerie noise. Cautiously, I walked towards the sound, and when I got into the kitchen, I was shocked by what I saw. The white walls in my apartment were covered in cicadas. There must have been almost 100 of the horrible insects, and they were all perched on the wall, making that horrible high-pitched screech. The sight of them made my eyes well up with tears. I had a bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. Where could they have come from? I wondered. Did I accidentally leave a window open? Did they come through the ventilation fan? As I got closer to the hordes of screaming cicadas on the wall, I noticed something that filled me with terror. They weren't moving. Each and every one of the cicadas was fixed to the wall with a pin. I immediately ran out of the apartment. When I was out on the street, I called the police, and I waited anxiously for them to arrive. 2 officers showed up and searched my apartment. They didn't find anything out of place. Nothing had been stolen, and there were no signs of forced entry on the front door. All of the windows were tightly shut. The police came to the conclusion that someone must have broken into my apartment while I was away and pinned the cicadas to the wall. They said that the intruder may have entered through a small window in the bathroom. The most frightening thing about this is that my apartment is on the 5th floor of the building. There was a woman named Jackie who lived in a rented bungalow house with a 2-year-old son, Jamie, and her baby daughter, Samantha. About a month after she moved in, she began hearing strange noises. It sounded as if the noises were coming from the attic. She tried to ignore them, but every time she heard the unexplained noises, it kind of began to send a chill down her spine. One night, she noticed that the trap door that led to the attic was hanging slightly open. She had never opened it and had no idea what was up in the attic. She was too scared to go up and investigate, so she just closed the trap door again. She had the strangest feeling that she was not alone in her house. Jackie hired a 16-year-old girl named Tina to babysit her children. One day when they were in the kitchen, they noticed weird glowing lights floating around near the trapdoor in the ceiling. Jackie grabbed her camera and told the babysitter to take some pictures. As soon as Tina looked through the camera lens, she saw something that terrified her. She screamed in horror and dropped the camera, and both of them ran out of the house in fear for their lives. The babysitter said what she had seen was the ghostly image of an old man with a face that looked like a skeleton. One day, she went shopping. When she came home, she walked into the kitchen and found something creepy on the refrigerator. The magnetic letters of the alphabet that sat on the fridge door had been rearranged to read, "Get the hell out." It unnerved her so much that she couldn't sleep, and she spent the entire night awake, watching over her children. In the middle of the night, she heard what sounded like loud breathing. She went down the hallway, looking for the source of the noise. When she opened the door to the spare bedroom, she recoiled in horror. What she saw was an old man sitting on her son's bed. Jackie was so terrified that she grabbed her kids and ran out of the house. She couldn't afford to move out of the house, and she was worried that if she told anyone what was going on, they would think that she was out of her mind. The next day she was in the kitchen, washing the dishes, and she noticed that her rubber gloves were covered in what looked like blood. She pulled off the gloves, but there were no cuts on her hands. Then she looked around and saw blood pouring down the kitchen walls. That night, Jackie woke up in the middle of the night and felt someone holding her down. She couldn't get up and she couldn't breathe. She thought that she was going to die. Suddenly, whatever was holding her let her go. She then grabbed her kids and ran out of the house. For Jackie, that was the last straw. She couldn't take it anymore. She called in a team of paranormal investigators and asked them to find out what was going on in her house. The next evening, the investigators arrived with all of their equipment. They set up cameras all over the house, and Jackie told them all the supernatural events that she had experienced. All of a sudden, the lights went out. They suspected that whoever or whatever was haunting the house was angry that the investigators were there. When the lights came back on, one of the investigators decided to go up into the attic and take some pictures. He climbed up through the trap door, and the rest of the team waited for him to come back down. All of a sudden, they heard a scream coming from the attic. The investigator fell through the trap door and claimed that something had grabbed his camera. Just then, they heard the sound of someone walking around in the attic, even though the investigator says that there was no one up there. The investigator gathered his courage, went back up into the attic, recovered his camera, and immediately left the house. 2 other investigators decided to go up into the attic with a flashlight and another camera. The rest of the team waited patiently and silently in the kitchen. They heard a loud snap, and the investigators in the attic started yelling and screaming. When they came back down, one of them was choking and gasping for air. He had red marks around his throat. They said that something had attacked them when they were up in the attic. When they looked at the pictures that they had taken on the camera, they were horrified by what they found. In one picture, One of the investigators had an old rope around his neck like a noose, and he looked like he was being hung. Jackie, her children, and the team of investigators left the house screaming. After that, Jackie refused to spend another night in the house. She gathered her children and they all moved out. Since that time, the house has been rented to other people, but none of them stay for very long. To this day, everyone involved in the case is still haunted by what happened in the attic. The scariest thing about this story is that it's allegedly true. It happened in San Pedro, California in 1989, and the woman's name was Jackie Hernandez. It all began when we moved into the old house. One day, my 4-year-old daughter started screaming at something she had seen in the living room. She said it was a cloud of red mist that emerged from one of the corners of the room. It had enveloped her, and it had a horrible smell that made her sick, and then it just disappeared. At first, we just kind of dismissed it, but a few days later, my wife's sister came to visit, and she brought her 2 little daughters. The little girls said that they saw a cloud of red mist appear from the same corner, and it enveloped them too. Later that same day, my wife saw the cloud of red mist come out of the corner, and it wrapped itself all around her. She said it felt hot and suffocating, and it stank of burning meat. One night, my 6-year-old son heard the front door opening, so he went down to investigate. The door was open, and in the doorway, he could see an odd red mist that slowly disappeared before his eyes. At this point, I was still skeptical of all these stories. I hadn't seen anything yet. That changed on the night that I fell asleep downstairs. I had a very strange dream. In the dream, I walked into our bedroom, but it was completely different. There were no beds, and it was furnished as a living room. There was a sofa, and sitting on it, I saw a beautiful woman with dark red hair. She was not my wife, but in a dream, I somehow knew that she was my wife, if that makes any sense. She was crying, and when she turned around and looked at me, her eyes were blackened and filled with tears. She had a look of fear on her face, and when I moved towards her, she cowered as if she was a dog that had been beaten. Just then, I heard a voice behind me. It was the voice of a young boy. I turned and I saw a boy standing in the doorway. He was wearing red corduroy pants and a red sweater. He was soaking wet from head to toe, and his skin looked ashen and lifeless. He wasn't my son, but in the dream, similar to the woman, I somehow knew that he was my son. The boy looked up at me. "Dad?" he said, with a look of fear in his eyes. "Dad, help me!" Suddenly, I woke up and I found myself sitting on the sofa downstairs. My wife was sitting beside me and she screamed at me, "What was that?" I realized that there were sounds of a struggle going on upstairs. We could hear furniture being thrown and the sound of breaking glass. I jumped off the sofa and I ran upstairs, but when I got to the top of the stairs, everything went silent. There was nobody there. There was nothing out of place. There was no sign that anything was wrong. All I saw was a strange red mist in the hallway. It had an iridescent glow, and it gradually dissipated until it disappeared completely. I returned downstairs to tell my wife what I had seen. We sat there in silence, unsure of what was happening, and we waited for the dawn to come. That morning I was standing on my front porch, still trying to make sense of the dream that I'd had. My son was playing in the garden. All of a sudden, I heard him call out. A chill ran down my spine as I heard him say, "Dad?" I turned and looked down the hill. My son, my actual son, said, "Dad, help me!" I ran over to him, and I saw he was digging something out of the ground. It was a strip of red corduroy material. I went to help him, but when I pulled the material away, I saw a flash of white bone underneath it. I picked my son up, and we ran inside of the house. We called the police, and when they came, they dug up the remains of a little boy. He'd been buried in our garden. They said he was 6 years old when he died. He was wearing red corduroy pants and a red pullover. The police are trying to locate the man who lived in the house before us. He was the father of the boy, and they believe that he murdered his own son, but they haven't been able to find him. They also believe he murdered his wife, but they can't find her body. They do have old pictures of her. I told them about the dream that I had, and they shared some pictures of her with me. She was a beautiful woman with dark red hair. When I was in high school, I was a really naive, sheltered teenager. We lived in a really close community where there was never any crime. There was a married couple who moved in at the end of our block. They had 2 girls. One of them was the same age as me, and the other was like 2 years older. There's no nice way to put this. The girl who was my age was really ugly. She kind of looked like Sloth from the Goonies. However, her older sister was a really cute girl. I mean, she looked like a model. I sat next to Sloth, the younger sister, in a few of my classes at school. I also worked on some projects with her. One day, when I was sitting beside her in class, I started making idle chit-chat with her. She looked straight into my eyes and said, "You better watch out. My older sister likes you, and the last boy she liked is the reason we had to move." I was so shocked, I didn't even know what to say. She made it sound so grave and serious, and that was all she said to me. A few weeks later, my parents went out shopping and I was left home alone. It was nighttime, and all of a sudden, I heard the doorbell ring. When I answered the door, there was nobody there. And then I noticed a small envelope with my name on it sitting on the doormat. I picked it up and I opened it. Well, the contents were disturbing, to say the least. It was a long poem about me being attacked by a woman in a cape who snuck up on me, knocked me out with chloroform, and then tied me up and brought me back to her basement, where she did unspeakable things to me. I thought it must have been one of my friends pulling a prank on me. I called my friend on the phone and I told him, "You got me. The poem was super creepy and it really freaked me out." He had no idea what I was talking about. All of a sudden, while I was on the phone with him, I heard something banging against the back door of the house. It was soft at first, but it got louder and louder, and it kept going on and on. Then the banging suddenly stopped and everything went silent. I was still convinced it must be one of my friends playing a trick, so I peeked out the kitchen window. I couldn't see anybody, and I was still on the phone with my friend, and he was yelling at me to call the police. Just then, the doorbell rang again. I creeped down the hall, pressed myself up to the door, and I peeked out the peephole. Nobody was there, but I could make out a large black lump on the front porch. I could see what it was, so I flicked the switch for the porch light, but that didn't come on. At this point, I was so scared that I was about to have a heart attack. My friend convinced me to hang up and call the police. A few minutes later, a squad car came by and I looked out the window. Across the street, under a street lamp, I could see the older sister, a cute girl. She was just standing there, smoking a cigarette and watching my house. The police went over and questioned her. I saw them try to search her, but she started fighting and they had to tackle her to the ground. Eventually, they managed to put the handcuffs on her. When they searched her, they found a lot of things. They found the light bulb from my porch light, a jar of chloroform, a length of rope, and a bloody knife. It was bloody because the black lump on my porch was the next-door neighbor's cat. She had killed it and carved my name into it. The older sister was a really cute girl, but she was mentally disturbed, and her parents didn't care. The younger sister had tried to warn me, and I felt bad about calling her Sloth. She turned out to be one of the smartest and nicest girls in my school. I think she gave me such a cryptic warning because she was afraid of her older sister. She was scared that her sister would maybe find out and maybe even hurt her. I also felt terrible for the family next door and their cat that was killed. This is a true story, and even now, years later, I still get goosebumps when I think about it or talk about it. When I was 19 years old, I worked as a counselor in a summer camp. It was a really gorgeous camp with wooden cabins and a lake, but it was in the middle of nowhere. The camp was surrounded by dense woods. There was nothing but trees and canyons, and the closest town was over 20 miles away. One night, when everyone had turned in and was sleeping soundly, I was suddenly awoken. It was one of those times where you wake up and you have the feeling that something just isn't quite right. My heart was racing for no apparent reason. I just lay there quietly and listened intently. The whole cabin was wooden, with fly screens over the windows, so I could hear the sound of crickets and the breeze blowing through the trees. And that's when I heard it, a very faint cry for help. It sounded like it was coming from the woods. It was the cry of a young girl. I quickly got out of bed and I woke my roommate, who was another counselor. I told him to listen, and when the cry came again, we both heard it. We quickly got dressed, grabbed our flashlights, and hurried outside in the direction that the sound was coming from. It was intermittent, but I could clearly hear the girl's voice saying, "Help!" or "I'm lost," quite regularly and quite away into the woods. She sounded like she was in a lot of distress. The quicker we found her, the better, so we could get her back to camp safely. It was dark as hell that night, and all we had to light our way were 2 puny flashlights. The girl was out there in the pitch black with no way of seeing anything at all. The boys' cabins were on one side of the lake, and the girls were on the other. On the way, we ran into a female counselor. She had also heard the cries from her side of the camp. All 3 of us headed out into the woods together, shining our puny flashlight torches left and right and calling out to the lost girl. We were reluctant to go too far into the woods because we didn't want to get lost in the darkness. Whenever we called out to the girl and heard her respond, it sounded like she was quite far in. After walking for about 5 minutes, we could hear her crying and sniffling, so we knew that we were pretty close. It sounded like she was only a few feet away, and we could hear her saying, "I'm scared. Where am I?" in a sad, low voice. We kept trying to reassure her, and just when we felt like we were right beside her, she suddenly went silent. "We're here! Where are you?" we all called out, but there was no answer. Then in the distance, we heard her crying again. "Help me! I'm lost! Come quick!" We started towards the sound of her cries, and just when we felt that we were right on top of her again, she went silent. We called out to her. We waited for her to reply, and there was nothing. Then, from even further away, we heard her voice again. "Help! Why can't you help me?" At this point, we realized that something didn't feel right. We all looked at each other, and without a word, we decided to head back to camp. We called out to the girl and told her we were going to get help, and that we would come back with the search party. We could still hear faint whimpers and crying sounds from her, so we told her to sit tight and that we would be back soon. The 3 of us sprinted back to camp and rang the big bell at the main office to alert the whole camp that there was an emergency. The camp manager switched on the floodlights, then we all met in the quad for a roll call and a head count. We started by calling the names of the counselors. We were all present. Then, they called the names of the campers. All of the kids were present. Nobody was missing. They went through the roll call twice, even 3 times. Every single person that was meant to be at the camp was checked off, accounted for, and present. But what about that girl? The camp manager and the other counselors thought it was a false alarm and said that what we had heard must have been just the echoes of our own voices. They dismissed everyone and sent us back to bed. The 3 of us knew what we had heard, and it wasn't an echo. It was creepy as hell. The voice kept leading us into the woods, further and further, deeper and deeper. Someone or something was luring us deeper into the woods, and to this day, I have no idea what that mysterious voice intended to do to us. This was by far the creepiest thing I have ever experienced in my life. Myself and the female counselor believed it was something paranormal, but neither of us could explain it. The counselor, who was my roommate, refused to talk about it, and whenever we brought it up, he would say it was just voices echoing. But when I looked into his eyes, I could see that he was scared to death. He was just trying to convince himself that it didn't happen. In the late 1970s, my uncle was studying medicine at the University of Chicago. One day, after class, he decided to hitchhike home. A man drove up and offered my uncle a ride. He looked normal and seemed friendly, so my uncle got into his car. However, on the way home, the man suddenly took a different route. My uncle told the man that he was going the wrong way. The man looked at my uncle, put his hand on my uncle's leg, and smiled darkly at him. "No, son," he said, "you're coming home with me." My uncle froze up and began to panic. When the car slowed down in traffic, he quickly opened the passenger door, jumped out, and ran away without even looking back. A few years later, my uncle was watching TV when he saw something that made his blood run cold. There was a picture of the man that had picked him up. He'd been arrested for the murder of at least 33 boys and young men. The man on the television was John Wayne Gacy. He was a notorious serial killer. The police found 26 bodies buried under his house. The creepiest thing of all was that there were reports that he had removed the door handle from the passenger side door of his car to prevent his victims from escaping. This must have been something that he had started doing after my uncle got away. I live in Japan, and a lot of my friends have told me about their scary experiences with the supernatural. I guess the scariest one came from my friend, who says that he used to be able to see ghosts when he was younger. One day, he wanted to meet up with a girl that he had gone to school with. Her name was Asako. They arranged to meet at a popular location in Tokyo. However, when the day came, he waited there for a few hours, but she never showed up. Thinking that she must have forgotten about it or got the day wrong, he just gave up and went home. Later that night, he called her and he found out that she was mad at him for not showing up. Apparently, she had been at the meeting place at the right time, but somehow they'd missed each other. Although it was strange, Tokyo is a big city and the meeting place was busy, so they left it off and made plans to meet at a smaller train station outside of the city. But even this time, when my friend went to meet her, he ended up waiting for a few hours. He even asked the station employees to make an announcement asking Asako to come and meet him at the exit, but she never showed up. He eventually gave up and went home. He called her again that night, and she insisted that she had been waiting there at the exit like they had arranged. He told her how he had even asked them to make an announcement, and she said that she had heard that announcement while she was standing right there at the exit, but she looked and no one else was around. This really creeped them both out. So my friend suggested that he and his female friend Yukiko go to Asako's apartment and meet her that night. She agreed, and my friend and Yukiko headed over there right away. When they got there, everything seemed normal. They spent the night drinking and talking and having fun. They lost track of time, and before they knew it, they had missed the last train home. Asako told them that they could stay overnight and pulled out a futon next to her bed for them to sleep on. Somewhere around 3 a.m., my friend woke up suddenly. He was unable to move. When he opened his eyes, he saw Asako looming over him. She was sitting on his stomach. Her eyes were black and her face was pale. Her long black hair was also hanging down in his face. She was wearing a black kimono and had a strange headdress that looked like a 3-pronged candlestick with burning candles. As she moved closer, her hair started to blow around in a strong wind and it caught on fire. He could feel the searing heat from her blazing hair against his face, but he still couldn't move a muscle. He began to really panic when she reached for his neck, and he tried to call out to Yukiko, but his voice wouldn't work. Asako started squeezing his neck, all the while whispering something that he couldn't make out. Suddenly he was able to yell out, and he heard someone moving on the bed. He turned to look, and it was Asako, looking sleepy and confused. He looked back up at the woman strangling him, and then she disappeared. Yukiko was lying on the floor nearby him as well. He didn't tell the girls what had happened, so they wouldn't get freaked out, but about a month or two later, he went to a traditional play with Yukiko. One of the characters was the ghost of a vengeful woman who had been betrayed in her past life. Her goal was to hunt down the reincarnation of the man who had betrayed her and to kill him. She was pale, with long black hair, and wore a black kimono. She also had a three-pronged candlestick headdress, and her hair would catch fire from the burning candles on there. Later on, he went to a fortune teller and asked her about it. She told him that he had betrayed a woman in his past life, and that the spirit of the woman was reincarnated as Asako. When he had tried to meet up with her, his protector spirits had prevented them from seeing each other to keep him safe. However, when he went to stay in her apartment, he had trapped himself in a place where she could attack him. The fortune teller told him that he was lucky to be alive. When I was 15, I wanted to make some extra money, so I started babysitting. One evening, I got a call from a married couple asking me if I could babysit for them. They had a 5-year-old girl named Katie. I agreed, and I turned up at their house at the appointed time. As the parents were getting ready to leave, they told me that their daughter had some imaginary friends, and sometimes, at night, she would talk to them. "Don't let it freak you out," the father chuckled. After they were gone, I made dinner for Katie, and we played some board games. Then I gave her a bath and got her ready for bed. I tucked the little girl in, told her good night, and went downstairs to do some homework. About an hour later, I heard Katie's voice. I thought she might be calling me, so I went up to her room to check on her. When I opened her bedroom door, she was sitting upright in bed, talking to the closet. I walked in hesitantly, looking at Katie. I heard her mumbling things, but I couldn't make out what she was saying. "Katie, who are you talking to?" I asked her. "The man with the red face," she said. A chill ran down my spine. "Is he in your closet?" I asked. "Yes," said the little girl. "He makes funny faces at me sometimes." "What does he look like?" I asked, my voice trembling. She made a face to show me, and it looked like someone choking and gasping for air. I walked over and I kicked the closet door shut. Then Katie looked up and started flipping out, screaming her head off. "Go away! Go away!" she cried. Get out of my room!" She was looking straight at me. "Katie, stop shouting," I said, trying to calm her down. "Who are you talking to? Who are you telling to go away?" "The woman," she replied. "What woman?" I asked her. "The woman who always comes," Katie moaned. "She doesn't like the man with the red face." "Does she have a red face too?" I asked. "No," the little girl replied, and her eyes grew wide. "She doesn't have a face." "Katie, where is this woman?" I asked her. Then she said the words that will haunt my dreams forever. "She's crawling on the ceiling like a spider." With that, Katie lay down, and after a few moments, she was fast asleep. I stood there, shaking in fear. That night, when Katie's parents came home, I was still trembling. Every sound in the house made me jerk uncontrollably. They asked me if everything was okay. I lied to them and I told them that everything was fine. The husband told me that he would drive me home. When I got home that night, it was very late and I was exhausted and still a little terrified, but I was glad to get away from that house. The next day, I decided to look into the history of the house and I quickly found something that shocked me. Apparently, the house had once belonged to a family of 4. The father had found out that his wife was cheating on him, and when he confronted her about it, she told him that she wanted a divorce. The man flew into a rage and he went on a murderous rampage, skinning his wife alive and beating his 2 children to death. When he came to his senses and realized what he had done, he hung himself in the closet. The red face, red with blood, gasping for air, the woman with no face. It was all too familiar. I refused to babysit for them again. A few months later, the family moved away, and that house has sat abandoned for quite a few years. When I was younger, my parents rented a cabin in the woods. We would go there on weekends to spend some time in the wilderness. My brothers and I loved to explore out there. There was a dirt road that ran past the cabin, and at the end of the road, there was a small graveyard. It was surrounded by a wrought iron fence with spikes on the top. The gate was locked with a rusty chain and padlock, but we were able to pull the bars apart and squeeze through. The gravestones were very old and worn. On top of one of the graves, there was a small, smooth black stone. It looked like onyx, and when we were leaving, my older brother took it and he put it into his pocket. That night we were sleeping in the cabin. My parents slept in the bedroom, and my brothers and I slept in the living room. All of a sudden, in the middle of the night, we heard a loud banging at the front door. We were scared out of our wits. Bang, bang, bang! The door was shaking. It sounded like someone was trying to knock it off of its hinges. My dad emerged from the bedroom and asked what was going on. He heard the banging again. When he saw that we were all laying together and saw the looks on our faces, he knew that we had no idea what was happening. The banging on the door came again. Bang, bang, bang. My dad grabbed an axe and walked over to the door. He looked just as scared as we were. He raised the axe and opened the door, but there was nothing out there. The banging had stopped, and the night was black and silent. After we calmed down, we went back to bed, but none of us were able to get much sleep. The next day, when we went back to the graveyard, the smooth black stone that my brother had taken was sitting on top of the same grave. As soon as we saw that, we ran away, we left the graveyard, and since then, we have never gone back. A month ago, my girlfriend and I got engaged. We moved into a new apartment and began living together. It was the first time either of us had shared an apartment, so it was a new experience for both of us. We were deeply in love. I knew she was the one I wanted to spend the rest of my life with, and I was certain that she felt the same about me. Everything went well until about 2 weeks ago, when I noticed that my girlfriend was acting very strangely. She became so attached to me that it felt like she couldn't stand being away from me for a moment. One evening, she said to me, "Darling, when you're not at home, I still feel you near me." I didn't attach much importance to those words. I just thought she was being affectionate. However, a few days later, she told me something else. "Whenever you're at work," she said, "I often hear your voice, as if you're calling my name." This began to happen more and more as the days went by, and I started to get a little bit worried about her. One day, when I arrived home from work, I found her sitting silently at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the wall with a glazed look over her eyes. I grabbed a chair, I sat down beside her, and I asked her what was wrong. "I think there's something wrong with me," she murmured. "Why do you think that?" I asked her. "I saw you today," she said. "You walked from the kitchen into the bedroom, and then you stood with your back to me, staring out the window." "But I was at work all day," I said. "I know," she replied. That's when I really began to worry. I suspected that my girlfriend was losing her mind and she was starting to have hallucinations or something. Over the next few days, she kept telling me that she saw me in the apartment when I was at work. She could even describe exactly what I was wearing. My girlfriend was also acting more and more strange. She was getting more and more quiet, and she was terrified of being left alone. Sometimes she would just sit there, silently staring at me. Last night, my girlfriend was very tired and decided to go to bed early. I held her hand and sat on the edge of the bed as she was falling asleep. Just before she nodded off, she said, "You're not here." "Honey, I'm right here," I replied. "Don't worry, everything's fine." "No, you're not here," she said. "You're in the kitchen." Just then, I heard a dull noise coming from the kitchen. It sounded like a chair scraping across the linoleum. Then, I heard the sound of footsteps walking down the hallway. Fear gripped a hold of my heart. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. All of a sudden, the handle on the bedroom door began to turn, and the door slowly began to open. "Please let that just be a draft. Please let that be a draft," I thought, as my eyes grew wide with fear. But it wasn't a draft. The door swung open, and I saw a man standing there in the doorway. It's difficult to describe exactly what I saw. It was me, standing there, but at the same time, it wasn't me. It was as if I was staring at myself in a mirror, but the other me had cold, lifeless eyes. The other me looked at me for a moment, then turned and left, shutting the door behind him. It took me a moment to recover from the shock, and then I sprang up off the bed and started yelling and ran after him. The hallway was empty. I checked the kitchen, then the bathroom, but he was nowhere to be found. The other me simply vanished. It was terrifying. And then, as I stood in the hallway, trying to figure out what had just happened, trying to calm myself down and convince myself that it was just some kind of hallucination or something, I heard a voice, a faint voice coming from the kitchen. It wasn't my voice. It was the voice of my girlfriend. "We are here to stay," she said. "Forever." I realized that my girlfriend wasn't in the kitchen. She was lying in the bedroom, exactly where I had left her just seconds before. I was so frightened, I started trembling like a leaf, and I pissed my pants. I ran into the bedroom, I grabbed my girlfriend, and I dragged her with me out of the front door. We left the apartment that very moment and spent the night at my parents' house. Tomorrow, we'll go back to pick up our things. I still can't understand what happened in the apartment, but neither of us can bear to spend another night there. Hopefully, when we pick up our things, all will be well, and no one else will be in there. Thank you all for listening. We hope you enjoyed this collection of tales. Until the next time we meet, sweet dreams.